So this is a strange saying of Jesus. He says, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men or all people to myself. and then it tells us quite plainly here, he said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. So in other words, the crucifixion is a death where you are lifted up from the earth. And he says there's something about this that will cause everybody to be drawn to me. It's interesting that in the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each one of them has 3 times where Jesus predicts his death. And it's always something quite straightforward. He says, he began to tell them that he would suffer many things from the chief priests and scribes and be crucified and on the 3rd day be raised. And they said, wow, what are you talking about? And so 3 times in those Gospels, we're told about that. I think it's seized up. You'd have to restart it or something. Oh, there you go. Something clever happened. So it's kind of weird, but there it is. Yeah. And in the Gospel of John, we don't have that. In the Gospel of John, though, 3 times it says, Jesus tells us, when he is lifted up from the earth, he will draw everybody to himself, which is kind of a strange way of putting things. And the first time we find it is in John chapter 3, where he kind of compares it to the story. You remember when Moses was in the desert and all the Israelites were with him, and they were always messing up and they were always disobeying and worshiping all false gods and this kind of stuff? And at one point, God punishes them by sending snakes into the camp. And the people cry out, God, please help us, please save us from the snakes. So God says, Moses, I want you to build a special thing. He's to make a bronze snake and put it on a stick. And you hold it up in the air, and whenever someone looks at the bronze stake on the stick, they will be healed of their snake bite. Very weird. But that's the story. So this story out of the Exodus story of Moses. And even today, that symbol is on the side of medical arts buildings. If you look today, there are many medical arts buildings with the pole with the snake on it. You got to think, why is there a snake on the side of the medical arts building? But that's why. It's right out of the Old Testament. But Jesus said, just like Moses raised up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that all that look upon him will be healed. He's kind of making a parallel. So that's kind of the background to it. So there it is. But when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. So I got to thinking, how does that work? I mean, I know it's true. Jesus being lifted up, Jesus being crucified, has some kind of crazy draw to it. This event in history, which is unparalleled, it's not the way you start religions. You always start them with some kind of philosophy about how you're supposed to do this and not do that and attain something by kind of working at it hard. Not so with this. The whole thing is based on the centrality of this person and what happens at the cross. And he says, just when I'm lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. So some of the part of how that works, I believe, has to do with how we can identify with Jesus in his sufferings. When we read about someone like the things that Jesus went through, it rings bells in our hearts and in our life experience. So for starters, I was thinking about stress. I mean, we all have a ton of stress. Varying degrees of stress for varying reasons. We have emotional stress, we have mental stress, we have social stress, and those stresses kind of push on us, don't they? They can. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing. We know that actually without stress you probably won't grow. Your character gets formed by the stresses that are pushed upon you in life, and you adapt and you learn through stress. But it also too much stress is kind of destructive. So, for instance, now the reason this is in such teeny-weeny print is a technological problem that I had this morning. I had it in bigger print in a font that wouldn't go into any place else, and so it just had little boxes. So I had to redo the font, and I didn't have much time. So it's just anyway. You didn't really want to know about that. Quit whining. What's that? It caused me a lot of stress. Well, so I'll read it out for you. Millions of Americans suffer from unhealthy levels of stress at work. A study several years ago estimated the number to be 11 million. Given events since that time, this number has certainly more than tripled, which would be more than 33 million, Studies in Sweden, Canada, and other westernized countries show similar trends. Okay, next one. Stress contributes to heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, and other illnesses in many individuals. Some of you may be well acquainted with this. Stress also affects the immune system, which protects us from many serious diseases. So then the next one. Stress also contributes to the development of alcoholism, obesity, suicide, drug addiction, cigarette addiction, and other harmful behaviors. Stress in society is so prevalent that the U.S. Public Health Service has made reducing stress one of its major health promotion goals. So it's something that we're not unfamiliar with, something that we're it's very, very prevalent in our lives, and sometimes it causes us a lot of consternation and trouble, physical and emotional as well. So when we look at the passion story of Jesus, we find he had a lot of stress. He entered into this with us. Apparently the biggest question that people have that keeps them from coming to faith in Christ, for instance, is, how can there be a God, when there's so much suffering in the world, how can you believe in a God who allows such suffering? And if anything, the story of the passion of Christ answers that question as best it can be answered. And you really can't answer it completely, and usually not to people's satisfaction. They're just trying to make a reason not to believe. They don't want to hear the answer. But the fact of the matter is that God, through Christ, in Jesus, entered into that suffering in a huge way. And he entered into the stress. So that last week of his life, for instance, he lived it in Jerusalem, surrounded by enemies who were constantly trying to trap him. You read about a third of the Gospels, each one of the Gospels, is about the last week of Jesus' life. So that's how critical it was in the minds of the Gospel writers. That this was the big point in Christ's ministry or in his life that we need to concentrate on. We find that he had many arguments with the powers that be of his day. They kept trying to trick him up, and he would have to come back with snappy answers, which he did marvelously well. But he was constantly surrounded by people demanding his attention and so on. So for a week, this is going on. That in itself is stressful. Then the night before he dies, he realizes what's about to happen, and he goes to this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, with his disciples, and he goes aside to pray. And it says of him in the Gospels, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death.'" That's quite a thing to say. That's a degree statement. It tells us that there was such a darkness on him. It was like depression, deep depression had settled on him. My soul is sorrowful even unto death. He was that stressed. Another place it says that he sweat drops of blood. And that does happen sometimes when people are under extreme stress. In a later book in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, he says, "He offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears." This is a picture of Jesus in the garden, wrestling and struggling with the momentous thing that he's about to undertake. He offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears. So he definitely had a pretty good take on what it means to be stressed out. Next one, abandonment. Well, that's a bigger issue than sometimes we think. And this is a little Brazilian child that's been abandoned. An actual photo of a child like that. And that's not, you can find lots of these pictures on the internet and people that have been to these countries. All kinds of children throughout the world have been abandoned. They have no parents. They're on the streets trying to fend for themselves. It has huge, huge psychological implications. One of the worst things that happens to us is to be abandoned by others. We're very, very social creatures. And when we feel, there's nobody with us, it's one of the worst things. Or we fear that that's going to happen. It's pretty terrifying. Whether it's from someone we love dying, and that loss, that feels like abandonment sometimes, or someone that's close to you leaving you, the breakdown of a relationship of some kind, and that abandonment, it's very painful. So this was, I got this off, I think it was called Online Shrink or something like that. And they said, "Yes, abandonment fears can throw a monkey wrench into your relationships. They are tantamount to the most desperate and scary feelings that can arise for any of us. Without even being aware, unresolved abandonment issues can wreak havoc with our lives, driving us into a revolving door of failed starts and premature relationship breakups. And I underline that line because I think that's profound. They are tantamount to the most desperate and scary feelings that can arise for any of us. To be abandoned is a scary thing, and it's a very painful thing. It's a kind of suffering. And it's exactly what happened to Jesus. So we have a little picture here of, this is actually a picture, I think it's from The Passion of the Christ or one of those movies. And this is Jesus and Judas in the garden. Judas is about to betray him with a kiss. So this is one of his buddies, his good friends, who's coming up and he's going to give him a kiss to betray him so that he will mark him as the one that the guards and the soldiers are supposed to take away. So what happens in the garden is this happens. Judas comes and kisses him, and then it says, then everyone deserted him and fled. So in his hour of need, no one could stand with him, no one at all on all the earth. All his closest friends who'd spent years with him, knew what he was like, knew how wonderful he was, they fled to the four winds. The two famous ones, of course, are Judas, who kissed him, and then there's Peter. And Peter, who becomes kind of the lead apostle later on. But at this point, Jesus tells him, you will, before the rooster crows, you will betray me. 3 times. He says, no, that'll never happen. Sure enough, when Jesus is on trial, there's a courtyard scene, and they're saying, Peter, you're one of his friends. You're one of his buddies. You're from Galilee. And he says, no, I never knew him. And he says he swears. He curses and swears. He says, I never knew the man. So who would perhaps be one of his closest. The inner 3 were Peter, James, and John. Peter abandons him and even declares he doesn't even know the guy. That's abandonment. So, Jesus knows what that was like. He knew it firsthand.